Berlin, 1913. The air in Germany's capital smelled of ink, coal and discovery. Laboratories buzzed with experiments, universities overflowed with young minds, and every newspaper celebrated what many called the century of science. Electricity illuminated entire districts, medicine was defeating old diseases, and chemistry, Germany's proudest field, was transforming the modern world. In lecture halls and factories alike, people believed knowledge itself could perfect humanity. Science had become a new faith, and its priests wore white coats instead of robes. Among these believers stood Fritz Haber, a brilliant Jewish-German chemist with piercing eyes and a restless mind. To his colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Haber represented everything modern Germany admired: discipline, genius, and ambition. He had just completed his greatest achievement, the synthesis of ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. This discovery, refined by his partner Carl Bosch, promised to end famine by providing cheap fertilizer for the world. In every sense, Haber's invention was a miracle of life. Yet behind the optimism of 1913, something darker was stirring. The same chemical plants that produced fertilizer could just as easily produce explosives. Every scientific advance carried a shadow, and Europe, proud, industrial, and armed to the teeth, was about to learn how thin the line between progress and destruction truly was. Germany led the world in chemical research. Its universities were temples of precision. Its corporations, BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, were empires of innovation. They manufactured dyes, medicines, and synthetic materials that fueled the modern economy. Scientists were national heroes, invited to dine with generals and ministers. The nation believed that science and patriotism could coexist in perfect harmony. No one questioned that belief until the summer of 1914. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, few in those laboratories imagined that their formulas and experiments would soon be measured in lives lost. But as Europe mobilized, factories that once produced color and perfume were converted overnight into arsenals. The chemists who had given the world beauty were now asked to give it power. At first, many of them saw no contradiction. To serve one's country through science was considered an honor. Fritz Haber, like many of his peers, volunteered his intellect to the Kaiser's war effort. He believed that the mind could shorten the suffering, that decisive technology could bring a swift victory. The tools of creation would become, for a time, the tools of destruction. In those early months, the laboratories of Germany glowed late into the night. Glass flasks reflected candlelight, while chemists mixed acids, nitrates, and metal salts. The questions they asked no longer belonged to the future of humanity, but to the logistics of annihilation. How to make explosives burn longer, how to turn the invisible air itself into a weapon. Outside, the trains to the Western Front were already full. Inside the labs, a new kind of war was being born. A war fought not only with rifles and steel, but with molecules and equations. When the first shells exploded over France and Belgium, the ground trembled with science's new power. Haber wrote in his diary, "In peace, for humanity, in war, for the fatherland." To him, there was no contradiction. A chemist could serve both life and death, depending only on the nation's need. But others began to wonder, if science could feed the world, why was it now preparing to poison it? The answer, in 1914, was found in patriotism. Across Europe, brilliant minds on all sides joined the cause of war. In Britain, physicists designed better fuses. In France, doctors studied how to heal shattered bodies faster. And in Germany, chemistry, the empire's proudest science, became its sharpest sword. By the end of that first year, the optimism of 1913 was gone. Laboratories once dedicated to progress now smelled of acid and fear. The age of enlightenment had entered the trenches. The men who once dreamed of saving the world were about to betray it. one experiment at a time, and at the center of it all stood Fritz Haber, ready to prove that chemistry could win a war. Berlin, 1914. When war erupted, the excitement that swept through the streets reached even the laboratories. Professors who had once lectured on progress now spoke of duty. Fritz Haber watched young students trade notebooks for rifles and felt the same call. To him, science was the highest form of service, and now the fatherland demanded it. At first, Germany's scientists tried to keep pace with the practical needs of a nation at war. The Royal Army needed explosives, fertilizers, and fuel. The chemists responded. Haber's own process for synthesizing ammonia quickly became essential to produce nitrates for shells. It was the first sign that chemistry could sustain a war indefinitely. Yet Haber wanted more than logistics. He wanted victory through invention. The Western Front had frozen into a stalemate. Thousands died for a few meters of mud, and the generals demanded something, anything, that could break the deadlock. In meetings with the High Command, Haber proposed an idea so extreme that even officers hesitated to hear it. If you could not outshoot the enemy, he said, you could suffocate him. The laboratories that once promised bread for all mankind could now unleash a weapon drawn directly from the air itself. By late 1914, Germany's stock of chlorine, a heavy green gas used in industry, was piling up unused. Haber and his colleagues suggested releasing it from cylinders when the wind blew toward the enemy. It would roll across the trenches, burning lungs, eyes, and skin, forcing soldiers to flee or die. Generals doubted its effectiveness. Some called it unchivalrous, but desperation changed minds quickly. In January 1915, Haber received authorization to test his theory on the Western Front. His team of chemists and engineers, men in civilian coats among soldiers in grey, travelled to the front near Ypres, Belgium. They installed thousands of steel cylinders along a 6-kilometre line, each filled with compressed chlorine. The men waited for months through rain and shellfire, studying wind patterns like priests reading omens. Inside the trenches, few realized that science itself had joined the war. Back in Berlin, the laboratories worked day and night. Haber oversaw production schedules, calculations, and safety formulas. He believed the weapon could end the conflict quickly, saving lives in the long term. Others were horrified. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, also a chemist, begged him to stop. To her, science existed to improve life, not destroy it. She warned that the use of poison gas would stain the very soul of chemistry. Haber refused to listen. The scientist belongs to his country in times of war just as in peace, he replied. In April 1915, word reached Berlin that conditions were perfect, a steady wind blowing toward the Allied trenches. Haber prepared to witness history himself. The chemist who had once given the world synthetic bread was about to give it synthetic death. The plan was set. Cylinders would be opened by hand. The gas, heavier than air, would creep silently toward the enemy lines. Soldiers were told little. Even German infantry near the front were ordered to hold their breath until the wind carried the cloud away. It was an experiment on a scale the world had never seen. Every scientist involved knew what it meant. The rules of war, the ethics of discovery, even the idea of civilization itself, all were being rewritten in chlorine and steel. And when the moment came, when those valves turned and the first green mist drifted across no man's land, humanity crossed a threshold it could never return from. Ypres, Belgium, April 22nd, 1915. Late afternoon. The wind shifted toward the Allied trenches, a slow, steady current from the northeast. Along 6 kilometers of the German line, thousands of steel cylinders waited under camouflage nets. Fritz Haber stood among the officers and engineers, his notebook in hand, checking the direction one last time. He gave a nod. Valves turned. A low hiss spread like a whisper through the fields. Within seconds, a pale green cloud rose and drifted forward, thick as smoke, heavy as oil. It slid down into the shell craters and moved silently toward the French trenches. At first, soldiers thought it was just another smokescreen. Then they began to cough. The gas filled their lungs, reacting with the moisture inside, forming acid. Men clawed at their throats, eyes burning, sputtering foam. Some tried to run, but their legs failed. Others tore off their jackets, desperate for air that wasn't there. The front collapsed in minutes. Entire regiments, mostly colonial troops from Algeria, broke and fled in terror, leaving behind guns and comrades. The wind carried the cloud deeper until the bodies lay scattered in ditches like fallen leaves. Survivors spoke of a smell like bleach and apples, of skin turning blue, of the sound of thousands choking at once. The Germans watched through binoculars. When the mist cleared, the path to Ypres lay open. Yet their own commanders hesitated, afraid of the very weapon they had unleashed. The advance came too late. A new horror had been born, and both sides would learn from it. That night Haber telegraphed Berlin. The experiment succeeded. In his eyes, it was proof that science could end the stalemate. In his wife's, it was proof that science had lost its soul. Back home, Clara Immerwahr read the report and fell into despair. A trained chemist herself, she had warned him that using poison as a weapon was a betrayal of everything they had once believed in. A few nights later, while Haber celebrated with fellow officers, Clara took his service revolver into the garden and shot herself. She died in her son's arms. News of the gas attack spread quickly. Allied soldiers called it the devil's breath. Newspapers condemned it as barbaric, but governments everywhere began building their own chemical divisions. Laboratories that once competed for patents now raced to create deadlier gases. Phosgene, diphosgene, mustard. The moral boundary had been crossed forever. At Ypres, the earth itself absorbed the poison. Grass turned grey. Horses collapsed where they stood. Days later, when the wind shifted back, German troops marched through the same fields wearing primitive masks soaked in urine to neutralize the chlorine. They moved silently, stepping over the bodies of men they could no longer recognize. The smell of death clung to everything. The generals praised Haber. Kaiser Wilhelm personally promoted him to captain, calling him a patriot. Yet among his colleagues, the mood was different. Some refused to shake his hand, others left the institute entirely. For the first time, the scientific world realized that its discoveries could no longer be separated from politics. Knowledge had become a weapon of mass suffering. After Ypres, nothing in war would ever be the same. The gas mask became as common as the rifle. Chemistry, once the symbol of modern hope, was now a synonym for terror. And in the silence that followed the screams, the world began to understand what it meant when science betrayed humanity. Would the chemists stop here, or would they continue down the path they had opened? The answer lay not in conscience, but in calculation. The laboratories of death were just beginning their work. Berlin, May 1915. The city celebrated victory. Newspapers called it a triumph of intellect. The moment German science had proven its superiority over the world. Banners hung across the streets. Professors toasted in salons. But inside the Haber home, silence reigned. Clara Immerwahr lay buried in a modest grave, her death dismissed as a domestic tragedy. No one spoke of the revolver. No one mentioned that the night before her suicide, her husband had left for the Eastern Front to oversee another gas attack. For Fritz Haber, there was no turning back. He saw himself as a patriot, a servant of Germany, and he refused to question the morality of his invention. In peace for mankind, in war for the fatherland, he repeated to anyone who doubted him. He believed chemistry could shorten the war, end the suffering, and secure victory. But among the scientific community, something had broken. For centuries, science had been the pursuit of truth. Now it was the servant of death. Around Europe, universities turned into arsenals of intellect. Laboratories once devoted to healing were converted into factories of destruction. Britain's chemists raced to replicate Haber's formula. France's engineers built their own poison factories. Each nation justified its work as defense. Each claimed the enemy had started it first, and behind those excuses, the moral core of science disintegrated. Letters between scholars that once discussed new dyes or fertilizers now carried blueprints for death. The same journals that had published research on medicine and agriculture began printing diagrams of gas shells. For many scientists, the transformation felt inevitable. Progress itself had been drafted into war. The laboratory bench had become a weapon, but not all remained silent. In Switzerland, Albert Einstein, once Haber's friend, refused to join the cause. He wrote that science without conscience was nothing but destruction in disguise. His protest was ignored. Patriotism, not morality, was the currency of survival. For every scientist who hesitated, 10 others signed up to serve. In the German newspapers, Haber was now a national icon. He wore his new officer's uniform with pride. Photographs showed him standing among soldiers, his expression sharp and confident. He had become what he always wanted to be, indispensable to his nation. Yet behind the photographs lay the smell of chlorine and the weight of Clara's absence. By late 1915, the use of gas had become routine. Ypres was no longer an isolated experiment. It was the beginning of an arms race. New compounds appeared each month: phosgene, diphosgene, then mustard gas, each more refined, each more efficient. The same minds that had built the industrial age now perfected industrial death. And with each success, the line between invention and murder blurred further. When reports arrived of soldiers coughing blood in the mud, of animals dying in droves, of civilians burned by invisible clouds, most scientists looked away. They told themselves they were saving lives by ending the war faster. They told themselves someone had to do it. That was how morality died, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small justifications whispered in laboratories across Europe. The war had turned the language of discovery into the language of annihilation. Experiment, test, formula, once words of wonder, now meant suffering and death. For the first time, humanity saw that knowledge alone did not lead to progress. Without ethics, it led only to horror. When the wind changed over Ypres, when soldiers choked on air meant to sustain them, when a woman of science took her own life in protest, the illusion shattered. Science had betrayed its purpose, and as the front lines filled with gas and fire, one question echoed through the laboratories of Europe. If science could no longer save humanity, what was left to believe in? Berlin, 1919. The war was over. The Kaiser had fled, and Germany lay in ruins. In the laboratories once filled with smoke and ambition, the lights were dim. The men who had forged the weapons of gas and steel were silent now. Their victory turned to ash. For Fritz Haber, the war had ended not in glory, but in exile. His name, once spoken with reverence, had become a curse whispered in the corridors of science. The Treaty of Versailles banned chemical weapons, calling them crimes against civilization. Photographs from Ypres and the Somme had reached the world, faces scarred, lungs destroyed, men blinded by gas who would cough for the rest of their lives. Science, once hailed as the future of humanity, now stood accused of betraying it. Haber fled to Switzerland, hunted not as a war criminal, but haunted by guilt. Yet even in defeat, the contradictions of his life deepened. In 1918, he had received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, not for gas warfare, but for the same ammonia process that had fed millions. The world watched in confusion. The man who had given life to the soil had also brought death to the trenches. Could a single invention belong to both heaven and hell? His colleagues debated it for decades. Some called him a murderer, others a patriot who had obeyed his nation's call. Haber himself never apologized. To him, science was neutral, only men decided how to use it. But that idea, once noble, now rang hollow in a world that had seen clouds of poison roll across the earth. The legacy of his work did not end with the armistice. The formulas survived. Laboratories around the world kept refining them, studying gases more lethal and more efficient. When another war came 20 years later, they would return in even darker forms. What had begun as a scientific experiment at Ypres became a template for mechanized death. The chemists who had sworn to serve progress had opened a door that humanity could never close. Haber died in 1934, a broken man, forced from Germany by the same regime that later used his discoveries for genocide. His ashes were scattered near Basel. His story remained divided, part genius, part monster. He was proof that intelligence without morality can destroy everything it builds. After the First World War, the scientific community began to rebuild its conscience. New generations of chemists pledged their work only to peace. International treaties outlawed gas warfare, though every army secretly kept its stockpiles. The laboratories cleaned their floors, replaced acid tanks with beakers of medicine, and tried to forget what had happened. But the stain remained. In every bottle, in every formula, lingered the memory of how far reason had fallen. The world would later call the First World War the Chemists' War. It was the conflict that proved that knowledge, stripped of ethics, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. The men who once promised light had given birth to the age of darkness. Today, when we celebrate scientific progress, we still walk in their shadow. Every discovery carries the same question they once ignored. Will this serve life or death? The chemists who betrayed humanity are gone, but their lesson endures. That the mind, without conscience, can destroy the very world it seeks to understand.